And now we want to turn to foreign policy. And this time our program is going to be on Venezuela. I also want to introduce the other members of our planning group. Maybe just raise your hand so people can see you. Tyler Beebe, Amy Friedman, Naomi Marrow, Carolyn Resnick, and Peter Russell. So Venezuela, not so long ago, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America, and today it is one of the poorest, with 91% of the population living in poverty and 67% in extreme poverty. So what happened to this country with the world's largest oil reserve? Why since 2014, a quarter of the population of Venezuela has fled, including an estimated 700,000 to the United States. So Nicolas Maduro has been president of Venezuela since 2013, following the death of Hugo Chavez. And since, well, beginning in Chavez's time, but particularly during Maduro, economic mismanagement, corruption, stringent authoritarianism, human rights violations, high inflation, dependency on a single resource, being oil, and to a lesser extent, sanctions on by the United States have caused instability and despair. However, during this summer, there was a glimmer of hope that maybe change may happen. And with that promise, 12 million people voted. And through the results of the tallies, an opposition candidate was favored and won. However, our ever Teflon Maduro claimed victory again and has now managed to keep control of the presidency and power. Today, we're joined by Ryan Berg, who is director of the Americas Program and head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He will help us understand what is happening in Venezuela, if the country can be stabilized in the near future, and what should be the strategy for the U.S. in dealing with Maduro. So our hostess, Carolyn Resnick, will introduce our guest speaker. He will speak for 35 minutes, and then we will continue with questions from our panelists and from you, our viewers. Please, viewers, enter your questions in the chat tab at the bottom of the screen so I can read them to you and to our guest. As you know, our program is being recorded and archived on the Chappaqua Library website under Events and Foreign Policy. So please join us there. We welcome you. And then now let me turn our program over to our host, Carolyn Resnick, to introduce our guest.
Oh, thank you, June. Thank you. As June has said, Venezuela has certainly been in the news for a long time, and focus went on to it during the election this summer, and then all of the disputes afterwards as to whether the election was, the result of the election were fairly reported or not. Ryan Berg, this group comes up with topics many months in advance, and Venezuela seemed especially important, and I think it is even more so today. Ryan Berg is a wonderful speaker on this topic. He's the director of the Americas Program and head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an adjunct professor at Catholic University of America. He's had numerous appointments in various places, including the U.S. Foreign Service Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, Oxford University, the Council on Foreign Relations, and has published widely. He has a doctorate and a master's from the University of Oxford, and I think I'm going to turn it over to him. So thank you, Ryan, for joining us in your busy schedule. We very much appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you all very much for this opportunity. It's great to speak to these groups that are often so plugged in, so knowledgeable, so interesting. I love the enriching discussions that take place in these groups. And so thanks again for the opportunity to come here and talk to you about a topic that's very important to me and near and dear to my heart, which is Venezuela, a country that I've been tracking for years now, and a country that our program at CSIS tracks probably closer than any other country, or maybe up there with Mexico and Canada, our North American neighbors, as being one of the countries we look at most closely. And in fact, several years ago, we started this thing, which Carolyn just mentioned, called the Future of Venezuela Initiative, which is an initiative or a program within our department on the Americas, because we think things that happen in Venezuela are so important for the rest of the region. What happens in Venezuela doesn't stay in Venezuela. Sometimes, unfortunately, crime, criminality, the corruption networks that are sown from the regime in charge there, and also, of course, the 8 million now refugees that have left the country. So we think that where Venezuela goes, in many ways, that the region will go. At least some of the negative drivers of some of the things that are happening in the region. So we started this thing called the Future of Venezuela Initiative to give ourselves space to publish, to think, to write, and hold events on Venezuela. So this is a terrific opportunity for me to present to you some of the thinking that we've done on Venezuela over the years. June did just about as good a job as any in terms of giving you a panorama of where Venezuela is at present, but let me start my talk by just saying a few words about where Venezuela is in the sort of macro sense, and then we'll get into the weeds, because I know this group is very well read and well versed on foreign policy topics and has likely done its homework on Venezuela. And then from there, what I'll do is I'll talk about the approach that the two administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, took to Venezuela, and I'll talk about why some of those two varying approaches both failed in their own rights, why they had some qualified successes, but overall, by the biggest metric, of course, which is the political transition that we all hope to happen in Venezuela, why it failed, and why we're likely to live in a world where Nicolás Maduro continues to be the dictator of Venezuela between now and 2031, when his next term, which he claims to have won after this summer's election, runs up. And then I'll close by talking about some of the work we've done on what the next U.S. administration could do on Venezuela, and now we know it is, of course, a Trump 2.0. So first, on the macro context, Venezuela is a state that's been in a 25-year slow motion exercise in self-destruction. It's not just the 8 million people who have left the country. It's the fact that this is the largest economic decline in peacetime world history. Some of it, of course, has been caused by sanctions and by the pressure that the United States, Canada, Britain, and the EU have levied together in a harmonized sanction strategy. But much of it was done even before the US imposed sanctions in 2018 and 2019 through bad economic management. This is a classic case of a country with a crazy number of resources. It's not just the largest reserves of oil in the world, it's also some of the largest deposits of minerals, fresh water, timber, and the like, and has managed to mismanage it into a 75% decline in GDP since 2013. Again, the IMF says this is the largest peacetime economic decline in world history. There's no civil conflict going on in Venezuela. There's no conflict context whatsoever. This is just bad economic management coupled with the pain of sanctions over the top. And this is, and has been for more than a decade now, what we call at CSIS a criminal regime. What we mean by that is a couple different things. First, we mean that the regime itself, the individuals who make up the core of the leadership in Caracas, behave mostly like a faction of a criminal mafia. You understand more about the dynamics between them, the personalities, the characters, and how they think and behave by studying mafia or transnational criminal organizations than you do a normal government that looks to provide security, public goods, global public goods, and so on. The second thing, the second reason why we call it a criminal regime is, of course, because as the economy was contracting since 2013, and as the tax base in the country got smaller and smaller, Venezuela became a country that was reliant upon illicit economic activity, mostly drug trafficking and illicit gold trafficking, but there's all sorts of other illicit economic activities going on there: timber, humans, wildlife trafficking. I can go into those details if you're interested. But the regime makes money on all of these things, and the institutions of the state have been converted to assist in the furthering of illicit economic activity as the industries in Venezuela have declined, and Venezuela has been on that path of 75% GDP decline. So you've got a government that is highly repressive, but also highly involved in illicit economic activity and surviving, for the most part, on illicit economic activity, where now there is a sanctions regime placed over the top for human rights abuses and electoral theft. So there was a bipartisan policy going back to really the end of the Obama administration, that we needed to somehow induce a political transition in Venezuela. The Obama administration and then the Trump administration both bought into the argument that behavior change is unlikely to happen in Venezuela. The regime in Venezuela is not all of a sudden likely to become more democratic, more observant of human rights, less involved in criminal activities. And so, therefore, nothing gets better until there is a political transition. At the same time, there wasn't a desire, of course, from the United States to have an external imposition of any kind of political transition in Venezuela. And so US policy was restricted to the to answering the question, how do we induce a political transition from without? How do we work with an opposition on the ground in a country like Venezuela to try to get to some kind of political transition or negotiated settlement in the country, a power sharing agreement, something that actually gets the economy moving again and gets the regime there abiding by normal human rights practices again. And so, starting at the end of the Obama administration and accelerating in the Trump administration, the United States started to levy sanctions against Venezuela in response to the human rights practices, mostly the human rights practices of the regime, but also going after some of those criminal elements in the government. These are criminal elements that were operating within the halls of power, within the military and security forces in the country, that were moving drugs, moving people, moving wildlife, moving illicit gold, and so on. There's actually a criminal faction or a criminal mafia group that goes by the name Cartel de los Soles, because the military will wear sunburst insignia on their shoulders. So they actually called the cartel de los Soles. And much of the early sanction activity was focused on going after those bad actors within Venezuela. Now, if we transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, there was a strategy that was bequeathed to the Trump administration and then accelerated in terms of the sanctions and the focus on pressure as a political tool to induce some kind of transition in Venezuela away from Maduro and towards a democratic government. Eventually, the Trump administration moved to call this a maximum pressure campaign. They didn't call it that right away, but eventually it was referred to as maximum pressure, in the same breath as our policy against the Iranian regime or the North Korean regime. The Trump administration lumped it into the same category of countries that were under a maximum pressure campaign. What that meant was working with the opposition on the ground in the country to try to be more competitive in upcoming elections, as well as using external pressure, mostly from sanctions, to get the regime to negotiate certain concessions on their behavior, on human rights, and on electoral practices. The other thing that the Trump administration did, which was quite a novel interpretation of the Venezuelan constitution and quite a novel attempt at inducing political transition, was recognizing an interim government in Venezuela. In 2018, there were elections in Venezuela. The opposition decided to, rather than compete in those elections, instead to boycott those elections because the sanctions pressure was unable to get any sort of concessions from the regime about freer and fairer elections in the country. And so rather than participate in that process and lend credence to that process, the mainstream opposition decided to boycott. Maduro, of course, quite predictably facing a fake opposition, cruised to victory, claimed victory in 2018 and inaugurated in 2019. What the opposition then claimed was rather interesting. Through a legal interpretation of the Venezuelan constitution, a constitution which was passed by Chavez himself, by the way, if Venezuela is left without a legitimate president, a legitimately elected president, there is an ex officio office, an interim president, who is the head of the National Assembly, who fills that role as the interim president until such time as Venezuela can hold free and fair elections. And this was Article 233 and 333 of the Venezuelan Constitution. So you had a number of Venezuelans making that interpretation, Venezuelan legal scholars making that interpretation of the Constitution. And then you had a gentleman by the name of Juan Guaido, who was the rotating speaker of the National Assembly that year, also a member of the opposition, declare that he was going to interpret the Constitution this way. And as is said in Spanish, autoproclamó, he proclaimed himself or took the oath of office as the interim president of Venezuela. Now, the Trump administration was very quick to recognize Guaido and to recognize that claim, to recognize that interpretation or that reading of the Venezuelan Constitution. And then what it did is it got more than 50 countries at its apex to also buy into that same interpretation of the Venezuelan Constitution and to recognize Juan Guaido as the de jure president of Venezuela, meaning he's the legally recognized figurehead of Venezuela, protected internationally, allowed to travel outside the country and represent Venezuela and Venezuelans, as well as to control international assets that Venezuela otherwise would control, such as Citgo, such as frozen funds that had been sanctioned against the Maduro regime and foreign bank accounts and foreign central banks, such as $2 billion worth of gold in the Bank of England, money in the Bank of Portugal, state-owned enterprises that operate out of Colombia. All of these things were given, in a sense, to the Venezuelan opposition as an exercise in their governance after we recognized that Juan Guaido was the interim president of Venezuela. And so the Trump administration policy could be summed up by this external-internal dynamic. You had the external pressure of the cascading number of sanctions on both individuals and sectors of Venezuela's economy, combined with a very popular, at least at the outset, interim president in Juan Guaido, who throughout the period of 2019, if you remember, was able to galvanize millions of people in the streets. People forget this now, that the end of the interim presidency didn't particularly go very well, and the way that it folded up in 2022 was rather ignominious. But at its height in 2019 and in 2020, before the pandemic hit, the interim government was recognized by, again, almost 60 countries. It was in the mid to high 50s at its apex. Guaido was traveling internationally. The opposition commanded resources abroad, and it was able to get millions of people in the streets demanding political change of the Maduro regime. And if you listen to figures in the Trump administration, there were at least 2 points at which Guaido called major protests in Caracas and other cities like Maracaibo around Venezuela, and the regime was, quote, on the ropes. They were ready to leave. They were ready to negotiate away a transition that would give them a safe passage out. At one point, Trump administration officials even claimed that Maduro had a plane ready to go on a tarmac at a private military base where he spends most of his evenings because he's afraid to sleep in the presidential palace. I don't have insider information to be able to confirm or deny that, simply saying this is what the Trump administration folks say in terms of the success of the strategy. They nearly had him, and what held Maduro back in their telling was really the Russian support and the Cuban support that Maduro has on the ground in Venezuela. You have Cubans there protecting him physically, and you have Russians there present on the ground to try to help shore up the security apparatus in the country. So this is the Trump administration policy in a nutshell. The external, internal dynamics working in tandem to try to push Maduro to negotiate some kind of transition out of power. The Biden administration came into office being bequeathed this strategy of both the external and the internal, as well as a complex body of sanctions, over 400 sanctions, mostly against individuals, and then several against important sectors like the oil sector in Venezuela, and they didn't really know what to do with it at first. In fact, for the first year of the administration, Venezuela policy was on autopilot. It was almost indistinguishable from the Trump administration's strategy. There was only one sanction that was, in fact, changed from the sanctions regime that was bequeathed to them. However, starting in 2022, the Biden administration began a long and complex set of conversations with the Maduro regime in order to try to come to an agreement about both sanctions relief, but also to use that leverage that the US and its allies had built up through this architecture built in the Trump administration to get some real concessions on the presidential election in 2024. And those negotiations lasted for well over a year. They took place mostly in Qatar, but also in Mexico City, under the auspices mostly of the Norwegian government, also, of course, under the auspices slightly of the Qatari government. And this was really Biden administration officials talking directly to Jorge Rodriguez, who's the head of the National Assembly in Venezuela. He's the number 3 or number 4 in the regime, depending upon how you count, a very close and trusted advisor of Maduro, who had been empowered to negotiate both with the opposition and with the Americans and our allies. And what the Biden administration was really focused on was the 2024 elections, but also any concessions they could get along the way between the start of negotiations and those concessions and the election, I'm sorry. So one of the major concessions that the Biden administration was able to achieve was for the regime to permit in 2023 a primary election to occur within the Democratic opposition. One of the reasons why this is so important is that for years, the US, the international community, Venezuelans themselves have been complaining about the various factions within the Venezuelan opposition working against one another, backstabbing each other, working at cross purposes with one another, and allowing the regime to divide and conquer. One thing that the administration thought was if we can get a primary process and we can come up with a single unified candidate and get Maduro to make concessions on the election itself, we've put the Venezuelan opposition in an incredibly good spot to be able to compete and to be able to win an election in Venezuela such that the shock of defeat is enough to get the regime to negotiate a transition out. So you can start to see the two different theories of change coming into picture here. You have the Trump administration, more on the forced regime change side of the spectrum, with the external and the internal pressure working together, the sanctions regime combined with the recognition of the Venezuelan interim presidency in Juan Guaido. And then you had the Biden administration with the softer approach aimed at using the sanctions leverage that had been bequeathed to get concessions from the regime, as well as building up the Venezuelan opposition to compete in freer and fair elections in 2024. This culminated in an agreement that was signed. Before I go there, let me finish by saying the Venezuelan opposition had a very successful primary process. Out of that primary process came Maria Corina Machado, who, in my opinion, is a once in a generation type of political leader in Venezuela. She had been considered fringe and not mainstream for many years. She had been considered, she had been loathed, frankly, by the regime for even longer. And the US didn't have much dialogue with her over the years because she was not sort of one of the major four political parties in Venezuela throughout all this time. The Venezuelan voters said that they were tired of the main four opposition parties and their typical leadership, as well as their tired strategies, and they went with something different. Not unlike many countries in Latin America these days, they voted for a more anti-establishment figure, someone who presented herself successfully as an outsider, and importantly, a female candidate, someone who was able to present the maternal face of Venezuela in a highly effective way with a campaign focused on reuniting Venezuelans and the broader Venezuelan family, these 8 million people who have been forced to leave Venezuela over the years to find livelihoods elsewhere. Machado did a very good job of messaging the reuniting of the Venezuelan family as a core theme in her campaign, and she won an overwhelming victory in the October 2023 primary, more than 92% of the vote. So the next phase of this was basically culminated in the Barbados Accords, a set of agreements that were signed in Barbados that were the product of these two negotiating tracks by the Biden administration that included all sorts of guarantees about the election in Venezuela, openings for the opposition to compete, the fact that the regime would have to allow free and fair competition, it wouldn't be able to ban candidates, it would have to allow the opposition to freely move about the country, it would have to allow the opposition to have access to traditional forms of media, no forms of repression, rallies, protests, and other campaign events were supposed to be allowed. This was the agreement that the administration got the regime to sign up to, and in exchange for that agreement, the administration gave the regime 6 months of sanctions relief, particularly on the oil industry, and allowed it to sell its oil on the international market. Very quickly into the Barbados Accords, it was clear that the regime didn't have any intent to stick to its end of the bargain. And immediately after the opposition primary, it tried to declare the opposition primary results null and void. It started to call those who had helped organize the opposition primary before the Attorney General to be questioned and possibly arrested. It started engaging in human rights abuses again, imprisoning members of the opposition, breaking up protests, sometimes violently with live ammunition, and engaging in all of the things that it's always engaged in over the years. Absolutely zero media access for the opposition. Most of the media access for the opposition was garnered in non-traditional forms of media, voice messages, WhatsApp campaigns, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and the like. Members of the opposition were not allowed to travel freely around the country. There are some very important and inspiring videos of Machado going around the country in canoe, on scooter, one time on horseback, multiple cars along the routes to her various rallies, where she knew she would be stopped at certain points and would have to get out well in advance of the military checkpoint, walk through fields, swim through lakes, rivers, streams, what have you, and get in another car that was parked strategically along a rural roadside in order to make it to campaign events. So it was clear that the regime had no intent at upholding its end of the bargain. In fact, we went into the 2024 campaign season with the opposition in full campaign mode, but none of us knowing when the actual date of the election would be. One of the things that the regime promised to do in the Barbados Accords was set the date of the election. Imagine that, an election where you don't actually know when the election is going to happen. And this is yet another tool that the regime uses in order to be able to control elections and keep its hold on power. In Venezuela, there have been times where it's called elections on 1 or 2 months' notice, sometimes as important as for the office of the presidency, essentially giving the opposition no time to organize. Eventually, the regime decided that July 28th would be the election date, and Maduro started campaigning. At the same time, the regime, again, not in accordance with the Barbados agreements, decided that Maria Corina Machado was simply too popular and that she was not allowed to run for office. They confirmed a court ruling against her that she was, what we say in Spanish, inhabilitada, unable to hold public office for 15 years because she had been found guilty of a trumped up charge of money laundering, as well as guilty of calling for and supporting US sanctions against the government in Caracas. What the opposition quickly did thereafter was shift to an alternative candidate, Corina Lloris, who, as well as Maria Corina Machado, was declared ineligible. So you had two opposition candidates. You had Maria Corina Machado, who came out of the primary process, as well as Corina Lloris, the replacement candidate, both declared ineligible to run for office, representing the opposition. Eventually, you had a 75-year-old diplomat by the name of Edmundo González Urrutia step forward and was accepted by the regime-controlled Electoral Council to run for office representing the opposition. Because the regime thought that this man is obscure enough, he was plucked from obscurity, he was a backbencher in the opposition, he served on a foreign policy advisory committee. I think that was the highest position he had ever held. And prior to that, he was a career civil servant, an ambassador to a few different countries in the 1990s, even before Hugo Chavez took over as president in 98. And so the regime thought there's no way that this man will be able to compete effectively. Machado is effectively out of the picture. Corina Lloris, her preferred successor, is effectively out of the picture. And we have our preferred opposition candidate. What happened was anything but what the regime expected. Maria Corina Machado continued her tireless efforts and managed to campaign with Edmundo González Urrutia everywhere that she went. She sought to transfer her popularity, her mandate, the fact that 90+% of Venezuelans voted for her, to Edmundo González Urrutia, saying, he is our guy, he is the one who represents our mandate. I'm not able to run because of an injustice perpetrated by the regime, but he is our candidate, and we should vote for him on July 28th. At the same time, one of the things that Machado did that was her greatest contribution, in my opinion, to the opposition. There are many contributions that she's made. The rallies with millions of people were incredibly impressive. The message was incredibly impressive. The maternal message, especially of uniting Venezuelan families, the way she connected with voters at rallies, all of that was impressive. But perhaps the most impressive thing that she did was begin to build a network of individuals in the opposition who could oversee what they all knew would be voter fraud on July 28th, because that's the way that the regime in Venezuela has always engaged in elections. The problem is that the Venezuelan opposition has never had a way of catching the regime in the act. The numbers have never added up after the elections have been held. 2013 was an unfair election. 2018 was an unfair election. And they knew that history would repeat itself in 2024 would be an unfair election. What happened, however, was that the opposition this year was able to actually build a very robust network of volunteers to go and monitor polling places in order to catch fraud in action. And so what Machado did was use her engineering background to build a system that could catch the regime in the act. They enlisted thousands of volunteers, trained them in poll watching, and then registered them successfully with the National Electoral Council, which is a regime-controlled institution in Venezuela, in order to monitor polling places around the country. And the opposition says it had about 98 or 99% of the polling places around the country, urban and rural alike, covered on election day. And most importantly, what they were able to do was get the voter tallies after the polls had closed. Venezuela uses voting machines, where the voting machines at all of the voting places tally up all of the ballots that have been put into the machines throughout the day. They have one centralized printout from each voting place, which is called in Spanish the acta. You've probably heard that term if you've been watching Venezuela coverage. And it sends that acta digitally back to the central office of the National Electoral Commission in Caracas on election night. What happened on election day, when the regime felt overconfident that it was going to beat Edmundo González Urrutia, was that halfway through the sending of those actas to the central office in Caracas, the transmission stopped. And we all feared the worst, because the regime started to see the numbers that were coming in, especially from places that used to be Chavista strongholds, places that would vote overwhelmingly in favor of Chavez and of his successor, Maduro, all of a sudden not voting anymore in favor of Chavismo as a political movement and experimenting with voting for the Venezuelan opposition. And so they stopped the transmission of those votes. We all started to fear the worst. And in fact, after midnight on election day, Elvis Amoroso, the head of the National Electoral Council, came out and said the National Electoral Council had been hacked, that there had been a hack coming from North Macedonia, which had brought down the website entirely, and that they couldn't release the full results of the election. However, based on 83% reporting, the regime was able to say that Maduro won an indisputable electoral victory, and that this was a fait accompli. And so eventually the National Electoral Council would be able to count the rest of the votes once the alleged hack was in abeyance. But for now, they couldn't let us know anything more, simply that Maduro had won and that the results of the election were indisputable and not able to be challenged by the opposition. At one point, the state's coverage of the election on state TV showed that more than 100% of people had voted. At one point, the tallies added up to 120%, which was of course some creative accounting. I can't see all of you because we have black screens, but I imagine some folks are chuckling at the moment. So we saw incompetence in the attempt to thieve the election. But importantly, just after the National Electoral Council made its announcement, which was expected, that the regime had won re-election to another 6-year term, the opposition announced that it was in possession of over 80% of the actas from all of the polling places around the country. A brilliant strategy pulled off by Maria Corina Machado to actually prove that the regime committed electoral fraud. And what we called it at CSIS was the mother of all electoral frauds, because what the actas showed, what over 80% of the actas showed, is that Edmundo González Urrutia was winning by a ratio of more than 2-1. He was between 67 and 70% compared to Maduro's 30% before the transmission stopped. And those actas are on a website now called resultadosconvenezuela.com. You can still see them to this day. They're two-step authorized. They have a QR code for protection. They can't be faked. Electoral experts have looked at these actas and said that, in fact, they are legitimate. And so what has happened is that before the eyes of the world, the Venezuelan opposition has managed to prove the fraud that Maduro has committed on July 28th. And so all of this up to this point seems to prove the Biden administration's thought process that the overwhelming shock of losing an election to the opposition would mean that Maduro would eventually leave and we would get a political transition in Venezuela. What transpired after the election, however, was anything but a political transition. People started coming down from poor neighborhoods poor neighborhoods that had voted for the opposition for the first time in 30 years, demanding that their vote be counted. And they were met with live ammunition, water cannons, tear gas, and other types of dispersal mechanisms to violently repress the opposition. By the time all was said and done, the regime had arrested more than 2,000 people in a short period of time. Still, almost 2,000 people remain political prisoners in Venezuela, many of them opposition sympathizers or members. But probably most tragically of all of this, many of them young children who were caught up in the crossfire. There are children as young as 9, 10 years old, subjected to torture and sexual abuse, currently in Venezuelan prisons. Human rights abuses that not many of us can fathom at present. So Maduro is cracking down. He continues to crack down. He says he's not going to leave. He says he won the election. And of course, his international backers, China, Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Syria, Belarus, other like-minded countries have said that they recognize his victory. But a good portion of the rest of the world has said that they do not recognize his victory until such time as he actually shows the results. The official regime explanation, more than 3 months after the election, Thanksgiving Day was 3 months after the election. More than 3 months after the election, we still have the regime claiming that the National Electoral Council is under a massive cyber attack. It cannot release the official results of the election. But what they have released, in their minds, proves that Maduro won the election irrefutably, and he plans to inaugurate himself for another 6-year term, January 10th. Those who don't recognize Maduro's victory, the US, Canada, the UK, the EU, and a good swath of Latin American countries, are back at square one, in the sense that they have not recognized Maduro's victory, and they're looking to recognize the opposition's victory, but that basically puts us right back where we were in the Trump administration. Through the Biden administration's policies, we've ended up once again at the conundrum of the Trump administration, where we look very likely in the next 4 years to recognize a de jure president who is not in Venezuela anymore. One of the elements of the story that I forgot to mention is that Edmundo González Urrutia has been sent into exile forcibly by the regime. He's currently in Spain, although his family was not allowed to leave Venezuela, and so they have this sort of Damocles hanging over his head. But we look once again to be back at square one in terms of recognizing a de jure president who is outside of Venezuela, unable to exercise power within Venezuela, and then a de facto president in Venezuela in Nicolas Maduro, whom we recognize to still have control over the security apparatus, all of the human rights abuses that are happening there, and so on. So those are the two different approaches, which I think quite ironically ended in many ways at the same spot, the same conundrum, the same a general dilemma of not being able to affect change from the outside in. A few quick thoughts before I close, because I've gone on for too long now, but a few quick thoughts before I close about where we might go in a Trump 2.0 on Venezuela. One thing that I've written in the past 2 months is an important piece in Foreign Affairs, which you may choose to visit after this conversation, called The Case for Containment in Venezuela. It was written by a colleague of mine at Chatham House in London, Christopher Sabatini. And together we write that both parties, both administrations have failed. They've achieved some qualified successes, of course, but they've failed at the broader strategy, which is, of course, to induce political transition. And maybe what this means is that this is a moment for strategic patience, for doing certain things that can exacerbate fissures within the regime, that can wait Maduro out and essentially speed up some of the failures that will inevitably take place within his regime, because there's not a vibrant economy there. There's really not a plausible way out of the current economic crisis there. And there's certainly not a plausible way out of the political crisis, which is Maduro's lack of democratic legitimacy despite his proclamations. And so the case for containment basically builds on the idea that George Kennan first put forth in Foreign Affairs many years ago, signed as his famous X article, where basically he looked at the Soviet Union and said, nothing gets better in the Soviet Union until the Communist Party is no longer in charge in the Soviet Union. The US, however, is not going to wage war against the Soviet Union, of course, to try to induce political change. Same thing with Venezuela. We have limited capacities to induce change from outside in. And so what we are doing is engaging in a strategy of containment. Deny the regime the ability to expand and the ability to ignore some of the internal domestic problems, the lack of legitimacy and the lack of economic prospects, in order to speed up what we think are going to be some of those inevitable failures with the regime. And so we draw a distinction, therefore, in this article between regime change on the one hand and regime failure. In other words, the externally imposed regime change strategy, which we haven't been able to get to in the Trump administration, and to instead aim at a regime failure strategy to deny it certain outlets in order to prop up its survival, such that failure of its own accord happens faster than it naturally would have otherwise. Failure because of the lack of political legitimacy, but also failure because the lack of economic legitimacy and viable pathways out of Venezuela's current economic dilemma. What this means in the short and medium term is, however, more of the same. It means that Venezuela is not going to stop becoming a country that sends more people out into Latin America and to the US southern border. It is not going to stop being a country involved in illicit economic activity. All of that is going to continue in the short to medium term. But what the US should do is, in order to pursue a containment strategy, go after some of those illicit networks in a more systematic way in order to deny the regime those expansion opportunities that it needs to survive. It needs money to survive. It needs money to be able to pay off those who are otherwise loyal to it in the security forces. It needs money to pay the cronies that comprise the elite factions within Venezuela's political circles. Without that money, it is more in trouble than it is with that money readily available at its fingertips. And so, as dissatisfying as it might be, you think a strategy of containment might be able to work over the medium to long term in order to get to regime failure as opposed to regime change. And with that, I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions, which I've hopefully managed to induce plenty of.
Ryan, that was marvelous. Thank you very much. That was, I've done a lot of reading on Venezuela in the last couple of days, in the last week or so, and this is a marvelous, marvelous, crystal clear summation of what's been going on. I had a couple of questions, and then I'm sure people on the committee have some, and hopefully some of the people from the public as well. What about oil? Some of the things that I've read that has been, as part of the Biden, you draw the distinction between the Trump and the Biden approaches to containment in Venezuela. As part of the Biden proposal was to allow Chevron to trade in oil. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
Great question, Carolyn. So November 26th, 2022, just after Thanksgiving that year, the Biden administration passed something that was called GL 41, General License 41. Only nerds like me pay attention to this kind of stuff because we're on the email list for OFAC, the Office of Financial Action, at the Treasury Department, which handles our sanctions policy. And this license basically allowed Chevron to have limited activities again with PDVSA, the state-owned oil company in Venezuela, under the assumption that you needed some kind of inducement to get the regime talking to you again. So this was part of getting the regime to continue engaging with us along the way, which eventually turned out to be the Barbados Accords, and then that laid the foundations for what we thought would be a free, fair election, was allowing Chevron to go back into Venezuela. Under the Trump administration, Chevron's activities were frozen. They were allowed to spend money only to maintain equipment and to pay workers in Venezuela, but they were not allowed to lift, right? So they had a huge backlog of inventory that they were sitting on, but they were not allowed to lift because that would have meant money to the regime. And what the Biden administration allowed and has allowed since General License 41 of November 26, 2022, is for Chevron to be present again at the 5 spots where it currently operates in Venezuela. That remains the case now until such time as someone does something about it. In fact, tomorrow at CSIS, if your listeners are interested, we have a live stream of an in-person event specifically about this question, exactly what to do about the oil lifeline for Maduro for the upcoming administration. And we'll have Maria Corina Machado herself coming to the event from a safe house in who knows where, because she's on the run, of course. But it should be an interesting event. I have a feeling that the Trump administration is going to come in and revert back to where it was in the 1.0 on Chevron, which is to give it a special license only to invest again in the maintenance of its rigs and the payment of its workers, but not to lift. And just to give you a sense of how much Chevron is lifting, Venezuela is producing about 900 to 950,000 barrels of oil per day at present moment. Chevron is producing about 200 or 210,000 of those barrels. So it's a pretty significant operation. And PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, needs the private sector like Chevron in order to realize some of the efficiencies of the oil sector. Without it, PDVSA has no chance at getting anywhere near 1 million barrels of oil per day production. So reverting on that license could have some significant consequences for Maduro if the Trump administration does that upon coming in office.
Thank you. That was great. So then just a couple others, and I know people on the committee have questions as well. What about the argument that's made that there should be some funding for human rights? You know, I mean, it's one thing to deny, to come down very heavy as the Trump administration did, but it's something else if people are starving.
Indeed. So the Trump administration tried a couple times to do a kind of oil for humanitarian goods deal where they were negotiating stuff with the regime. So it was a bit awkward because they were de jure recognizing an interim president, but then they were negotiating with the de facto president because we had to recognize that he controls the military, he controls the borders, he can, shut off our access if he wants to. They were negotiating with Maduro some kind of limited humanitarian agreement where oil could be pumped and the proceeds of that oil would essentially go to a humanitarian fund. At the end of those negotiations, we had even come around to the idea that the UN would administer the humanitarian assistance. It just became really difficult at the end to actually get the regime to sign on to the agreement because they were afraid, frankly, that even the UN would not be under their control. So they wouldn't be able to kind of control where the resources were spent, how they were spent, whether they were given to, whether the humanitarian assistance was given to political supporters or to opposition. And so in the end, they said that they wouldn't allow the UN humanitarian assistance to enter the country, and that basically ended those conversations. We had similar conversations in the Biden administration, and they ended in similar disagreements about the UN and other humanitarian assistance needing to be dispensed on the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is to say, in a nonpartisan manner, completely independent and objective. And that's usually been the point at which the Maduro folks say, no thanks.
Okay, and then one quick, what about the OAS, the Organization of American States? Some have condemned the election, some have supported Maduro. Does discussion of the pink tide that came in with Brazil and Venezuela. Any comments on where do you think that's going? His neighbors?
Well, the good news is that the Biden administration has been fairly deft in its political outreach to neighbors and its diplomatic outreach to neighbors. And so, what many of us feared was that Gustavo Petro, a leftist in Colombia, would immediately recognize Maduro's victory. Lula da Silva in Brazil, another leftist, would immediately recognize Maduro's victory, and they didn't. In fact, they stuck to the idea that Maduro would have to show the actas to prove that he won. And remarkably, they've stuck with that position even today, even as the U.S. has talked about ramping up sanctions on individuals responsible for this massive tide of repression. So I think we're in a pretty good spot with some of the neighbors. There are a couple exceptions, small countries like Honduras, which have recognized right away Maduro's claims of victory. But for the most part, most of the region is on the side of show us the actas, we'll recognize the victory. If you can't show us the actas, we're going to have to trust that the opposition, as they said, got the actas and you lost. And so we can't recognize. The OAS, the Organization of American States, has been a little bit more toothless, let's say, on enforcement of some of the resolutions that it's passed on Venezuela. It's passed several resolutions condemning the human rights abuses since the election fraud. It's passed several resolutions declaring that most countries in the hemisphere believe Maduro lost the election and must start negotiating a transition out of power. But what teeth does it have to actually enforce that? Right? Very little. So there's an informal grouping of countries that is being led by the Dominican Republic and by Panama to try to come up with some solutions for what to do regionally speaking. But as so often happens with Latin America, I do fear that this is going to be yet another instance of a problem that we just kind of wait out. And we hope it goes away, and we hope we can move on to other problems, as opposed to really bringing this thing to a resolution.
Thank you. June, I believe that you usually read the questions that come in by text. Do you want to do that? Okay.
Oh, you're
Okay,
muted,
let me
June.
read you, Ryan, a couple of questions. It says the U.S. made efforts to engage Latin American countries in supporting a transition.
Yeah, let me go a little bit deeper into my response, because this question dovetails with my earlier response to you, Carolyn, about
Okay.
what the region is doing. I mean,
Can you
I think
actually, Ryan, can you see the questions yourself?
I can read them off
Oh, then why
myself
don't you
if you
just,
prefer.
rather than me reading them to you, you handle
Sure.
it.
This is a question from Peter Cleaves. He asks if the U.S. has made efforts to engage Latin American countries in supporting a transition. Again, this one dovetails with my earlier answer to Carolyn. The answer is, of course, yes. We want to build, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration wanted to build the most robust regional international coalition that we could to recognize the opposition's victory and to try to give incentives to Maduro to negotiate a transition out. Latin American countries are only willing to go so far. And when I say that, most Latin American countries, with the exception of relatively few, Costa Rica is one notable exception, Ecuador occasionally on others, Latin American countries do not participate, like axiomatically on principle, do not participate in sanctions regimes. Some of them claim that they don't have the capacity financially to enforce sanctions. They just don't have the institutions to do it. Others are just opposed to the idea of unilateral or even multilateral sanctions, and so they don't abide or participate in sanctions regime. And so their participation in a coalition against Maduro and in favor of the opposition is limited to votes in the OAS, statements, protection for Venezuelan refugees, perhaps some support to the opposition on the ground in the country, but it's rather limited in the sense of what they can do if they're unwilling to participate in sanctions regimes. I think the Biden administration strategy, at least until January 20th, is going to be continuing to thread this very difficult needle, which is how do we continue to ramp up pressure on individuals who are responsible for this massive and brutal wave of repression, which continues to this day in Venezuela, while at the same time keeping Brazil and Colombia on board, right? Because it would be a huge blow to the cause of the opposition if Venezuela, if rather Colombia or Brazil just threw up their hands and said, you know what, we're going to recognize Maduro, which they might well do, right? Some of us fear that they might do that, fearing that there's or seeing that there's no resolution in sight. They'll make their modus vivendi with the regime. So keeping them on side, while at the same time trying to get as many countries in Latin America on board with this idea that Maduro needs to go and we need to offer him some kind of incentives to leave office. And those incentives, by the way, are not going to be pretty, right? There's transitional justice is never perfect, especially away from a regime that's committed, as the ICC has declared on multiple occasions, crimes against humanity. There will be human rights abusers. There will be nasty individuals in the regime who get a golden parachute for the greater cause of eventually transitioning away from this very problematic government. It's not going to be a satisfying transition. That's always the kind of unfortunate message that I send to audiences. And we need to get Latin American countries on board with trying to help with that transition however they can. But again, they're rather limited in the sense that many of them don't participate in sanctions regimes.
Thank you.
Shall I read the next question? It's from Naomi.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Are Iran proxies active in Venezuela trying to make inroads? In the same sense, are the Chinese working to get a foothold in Venezuela? Two excellent questions, Naomi. So I could have done a whole talk on Venezuela's external supporters. I'll instead just refer you to a paper, which I'll put in the chat box right now. We called it the Fabulous Five, how foreign actors prop up the Maduro regime in Venezuela. There you have it. Basically, we profiled China's support, Russia's support, Iran's support, Cuba's support, and Turkey's support for Nicolás Maduro in various facets of his regime. The Iranians are present, not to the same extent as the Chinese and the Russians, but they're present. They're present particularly in Venezuela's oil industry and also in sanctions evasion tactics. You have to remember that Venezuela, just like Iran, is a country that's under a complex sanctions architecture, and the lifeblood of both economies is oil. And so these two have found an easy collaboration in terms of ship-to-ship transfers of oil on the high seas, sanctions evasion mechanisms, which often include what we call spoofing of the AIS transponders. So when very large crude carriers head into the Jose terminal in Venezuela to pick up crude, they're often saying that they're in the Pacific Ocean or something like that when they're actually in the Caribbean, right, picking up oil in Venezuela. And this is a tactic they learned long ago from their Iranian counterparts. And then for a while during the Trump administration, the Iranians were providing diluents for Venezuelan crude because Venezuelan crude is really thick, right? It's really viscous. It needs a lot of refining, and it's not easily sellable to oil markets in the same way that other countries' crude is. And so Iran was sending diluents to make that crude less viscous in exchange for some Venezuelan crude, which it then refined in Iran. And so there was a kind of a barter system going on there to evade sanctions. There are a whole bunch of other ways in which the Iranians are involved in Venezuela and have been, going back to the Chavez days. Venezuela has bought a lot of military equipment from the Iranians, but I won't go into that. But suffice it to say that there's a deep relationship there between the Iranians and the Venezuelans. On the Chinese front, The Chinese are present more in the sense of financing of the regime. China was an early sponsor of Hugo Chavez when China was becoming more and more international in a lot of its support of other countries. And when China was launching the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, Venezuela was a large recipient in Latin America of Chinese financing, both from the BRI as well as from Chinese policy and development banks, to the tune of something like $64 billion. And so the Chinese, frankly, didn't really do their homework in terms of political risk in Venezuela. Much of that money they've had to swallow. Some of it hasn't been paid back. Some of it has been paid back, but they've been certainly waiting a long, long time for it. And the best way that I could characterize the Chinese are they probably understand that a democratic transition would bring them repayment much faster than sticking with the Maduro regime, but they're happy to wait 100 years for repayment if it means that this nasty regime continues to sit in the U.S. shared neighborhood, causing us all sorts of headaches, and also providing them a beachhead, frankly, to project power and influence in the region. So the Chinese are certainly less involved, say militarily, than the Russians, who are actually present on the ground with some of their troops, as well as maintaining some of the weapon systems that they've sold to Venezuelans over the years. But they're involved more on the financial end of things, trying to get repaid, frankly, from the $64 billion that they've extended in credit to Venezuela. And notably, over the last couple years, the Chinese have given nothing to the Venezuelans because they're fed up with the Maduro regime. In fact, Maduro took an important visit to Beijing at the beginning of this year or last year, and the Chinese, frankly, had nothing to give him. And so the only thing he left with when he went home from Beijing was an upgrade in the name of the relationship. So they went from a comprehensive strategic partner, which is Chinese Communist Party speak for really good friend, to all-weather relationship. What the heck these two things, the differentiating factor between these two things is, I have no idea. Even China experts have no idea, sort of where these things fit on the scale of friendliness. But suffice it to say that the Chinese are sort of losing patience with Maduro at the same time as they're unwilling, of course, to move away from him because having another authoritarian regime in the Western Hemisphere suits their purposes.
I think there's one more question, perhaps, and then we've taken a lot of your time.
The next question comes from Stanley Lenkowski. Has Maduro tried to pick a fight with neighboring Guyana over oil? This is another topic we've done some very interesting work on, and I could probably give an entire lecture on this. Stanley, what I want to do is give you two pieces that we published on this, and I'm sorry that I'm just shamelessly promoting all this stuff that we've put out at CSIS. But you have one thing here, and I can put the other thing in a second. We took some satellite imagery analysis that we had access to at CSIS, and we were watching as the regime was building up some military equipment along the border with Guyana and asking all sorts of questions about whether they might invade or not. To make my answer brief, again, because I could go on for way too long about this dispute it goes on for a long time. It has its roots in the late 1800s over the drawing of a territorial map in Venezuela. But essentially, if you look at Venezuelan textbooks going back to the 60s and the 70s, they're teaching school children that the shape of the country actually has this extra little finger on the end, and that's Guyana, right? That's 2/3 of Guyana. That's a territory that's the size of about the state of Florida, and that's the zona de reclamación, as the Venezuelans refer to it, the territory that they've kind of been screwed out of, so to speak, excuse my language, by the injustices of history and colonialism. And so in response to the October 23rd opposition primary, which was so successful, which saw 2.4 million people come out and vote for Maria Corina Machado, more than 92% of them for Machado, the regime, I think, started to realize that they were in trouble, that the opposition was mobilizing people. And I think they wanted a way to change the narrative at the end of 2023. And so what they did was call their own referendum in December 3rd, 2023, if I'm not mistaken, where they had 5 questions on this referendum, and they went to a question they knew they could win, which is, do you believe that the Guyana Essequibo is Venezuelan territory? Do you believe that Venezuela should fight for it? Do you believe that Venezuela should declare a new state, right, and administer this territory? 5 questions. And then they claim during this referendum process that just as many people as voted for Machado voted in the referendum. We have plenty of evidence proving that that wasn't the case. Empty polling places on election day, extending the hours to vote, arbitrarily by 2 or 3 hours in many voting places to try to get people out to vote. And no variance among the questions, right? 95% of people, again, more than Machado's vote, 95% of people voting for all 5 questions in the affirmative. So the timing of it is all suspicious. The question was suspicious in and of itself because the regime knew it was going to win. This has been the subject of propaganda for years, and so on. And it's one of the few things that both the opposition and the regime can agree on, is that this slice of territory should be rightly Venezuelan. And so what this gave the regime was a chance to change the narrative, to create a distraction from the success of the opposition primary, as well as to test, we think, it was an ability to test its mobilization capacity with its typical supporters. And what the regime saw on referendum day was that it was in trouble, right? It couldn't mobilize the same number of people over an issue that should be easy to mobilize Venezuelans. And yet it got far fewer people to the polls than Maria Corina Machado did when she was running in the primary. Then Venezuela had to act on this, right? And so it had to say, okay, we're creating this new state. We're going to administer this new state. We're going to take this territory. That, of course, got everybody on high alert, thinking that Venezuela was preparing for an invasion. This was exactly the storyline that Venezuela wanted, because it allowed them to change the narrative from Maria Corina Machado is kicking Maduro's butt and has this huge mandate to face him in next year's election, to, oh my gosh, Venezuela is going to create a conflict with its neighbor. And mind you, this was mere months after the Gaza-Israel crisis had broken out. Ukraine, Russia was still at that time, in full swing. We were talking about supplementals still at that point. We weren't talking about potentially winding things down through a negotiated process. So the last thing that the U.S. wanted, of course, was a conflict on another front. And the regime was able to use this quite deftly to be able to change the narrative and use it as an issue to drive up nationalism and also to divide the opposition. Because the other thing that the regime claimed was that the opposition wasn't effectively fighting for this territory the same way that the regime was. The opposition was traitors because they denounced this exercise as a sham. Only traitors wouldn't support this territory belonging to Venezuela, and so on. So it served a number of purposes for the regime. And what we do in this piece that I put into the chat box is we just look at some of the satellite imagery showing tanks, missiles, other types of things going to the border, and asking the question, could we inadvertently walk into some kind of conflict, right? Because some imbecile on the Venezuelan side of the border decides to get trigger happy and accidentally shoots something, right? A very scary situation until it was resolved through diplomacy and deterrence by the Biden administration.
Ryan, thank you. This has been marvelous. I just learned so much, and you're so knowledgeable and fluent on this subject. Thank you very, very much. Joan, do you have anything that you would like to say before we say goodbye?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. And Ryan, that was terrific. We certainly learned a lot more about Venezuela and, really how a country that at one point has so much potential has seemed to squander it for the time being. So hopefully we wish the Venezuelan people good luck and hope that things will turn around for them. We will then again be with you in 2 weeks on December 9th. Again at 11 a.m. We have a very special speaker, Annie Forsheimer, who will be speaking on human rights of women in Afghanistan. She's a former career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. She is currently a senior non-resident associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an adjunct professor at the City University of New York, and a member of nonprofit organizations advocating for African women. We look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. So remember, December 9 at 11 a.m. That will be our last program for 2024.
June,
So-
I think it's December 16th,
Oh, I'm
not the
sorry.
9th. Sorry.
Oh, please. Thank you very much, Amy. Yeah, I wrote it down and somehow in thinking the 9th, but thank you very much. So please, as Amy reminded me, it is the 16th. So anyway, thank you. We will see you in 2 weeks. And Ryan, again, thank you.